A wealthy individual on the brink of death. He requested a young woman from the streets to act as his daughter for a single day. As the millionaire faced his final moments, the girl unveiled a secret that left him utterly astonished. Show your support by leaving a like to keep up with the upcoming videos, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories like this one. Arthur Menezes reclined in the leather armchair of his study, gazing out at the expansive, meticulously maintained garden of his mansion. The landscape that once felt formidable now appeared desolate. He had crafted his wealth through countless sacrifices, restless nights, and choices that were often challenging. He had constructed a vast dominion that assured him admiration and authority, yet now all of that appeared trivial in light of the document he held. The doctor met his gaze directly, with a stark honesty, and delivered the news that no one wishes to receive. A devastating diagnosis granted him merely a handful of months to exist. I regret to inform you, Mr. Menezes, that we have exhausted all possible options, the doctor stated with a professional demeanor, yet a flicker of compassion shone through his eyes. Arthur, on the other hand, remained unresponsive at first. He had always been a man of composure, accustomed to managing every circumstance, yet this time there were no discussions, no provisions that could rescue him, only the unyielding burden of truth. The mansion, an impressive feat of design crafted by his own hand, now stood as a vast expanse filled with an eerie stillness. Workers executed their duties with a clockwork accuracy. Donna Irene, the housekeeper, had dedicated over 30 years to her service, yet their interactions remained confined to polite greetings and updates on the condition of the home. No one inquired about his well-being, and he chose not to share any specifics either. Loneliness had been a companion he had come to terms with over the years, yet on that particular day, it felt like an even greater burden than before. Arthur recalled the times when everything felt meaningful, when his drive propelled him to conquer every challenge. He began his journey from humble beginnings, toiling as an insurance salesman by day and dedicating his nights to study. Every penny he earned was poured into his aspirations, and gradually, the man who emerged from modest beginnings became one of the most esteemed individuals in the city. Yet, in his pursuit, he sacrificed many things: friendships, relationships, and most importantly, the moments to savor the rewards of his hard work. Now seated in that chair, he realized that wealth had enriched his bank account, yet left his life unfulfilled. The diagnosis prompted him to engage in profound contemplation about his recent years. He had amassed a fortune beyond what he could ever use in 10 lifetimes, yet he found himself utterly alone to enjoy it. He was without a spouse or offspring. I had never experienced a desire to create a family. He had always believed there would be time for that later, yet he now realized that time was not something he could command. That evening, Arthur strolled through the grand mansion. The lengthy corridors adorned with artistic creations felt more frigid than before. He stepped into his bedroom and paused before a portrait of himself, created when he was 50 years old. In the image, his expression conveyed the essence of a self-assured, unstoppable individual. How misguided are we when we think we have everything in our grasp? He pondered, releasing a sigh that reverberated through the vacant space. The following day, Arthur requested solitude. He dedicated countless hours to sifting through his diary, reminiscing over old photographs and perusing letters he had tucked away in a long-forgotten drawer. He seemed to be on a quest for something that could restore a sense of purpose, no matter how insignificant it might be. As dusk settled in, he arrived at a choice that even he deemed peculiar. She yearned to feel, if only for a single day, the essence of family life, particularly the bond of having a daughter, which occupied her thoughts. A companion to bridge the quiet moments that enveloped him, partner to engage in dialogue where the focus shifted away from work or finances. Arthur understood that the past was unchangeable, yet a stirring within urged him to explore a new path, even if only for a fleeting moment. The notion, though straightforward and seemingly unlikely, offered him a glimmer of hope. After years of monotony, he finally sensed a spark of purpose, a chance to break free from the drudgery and the relentless notion that his life was nearing its conclusion. One day, he murmured to himself, "Nothing will change, but at least it will be a departure from this void." Inspired by that phrase, Arthur Menezes resolved to infuse his remaining days with newfound meaning. Arthur Menezes awoke the following day with a resolve he hadn't experienced in years. The diagnosis lingered in his thoughts, yet rather than succumbing to the heaviness of despair, he chose to take action. The notion that had taken root the previous night of what it might feel like to have a family, even if just for a day, lingered in his thoughts. He felt an inner urge, a compelling force that urged him to take the leap, even though he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. After what felt like ages, he slipped into a attire that strayed from the confines of a tailored suit and departed the mansion without a word to anyone. He made his way to the heart of the city, a location he hadn't explored in years. The streets buzzed with a cacophony of sounds, vibrant activity, and an undeniable energy. Individuals hurried along, clutching bags, engaged in phone conversations, sharing laughter, and exchanging heated words. The scene unfolded in a whirlwind of activity, sharply contrasting with the stillness and chill that enveloped his grand estate. Arthur experienced a sense of dislocation, yet he was undeniably enthralled. I observed families strolling by, parents clasping their children's hands, couples exchanging tender moments, and elderly individuals conversing on public benches. For the first time, he understood the extent of his detachment from reality. He wandered through the streets, his mind a jumble of thoughts. He was uncertain about what he sought, yet an indefinable pull held his focus. Then, just a short distance away, he caught sight of her. A girl, perhaps no older than 10, wore an expression that blended toughness with a sense of longing. At the entrance of a cafe, he stood there, clutching a box brimming with small packets of candy, eager to entice those who walked by. His voice, though quiet, held a tenacious quality. "Sweet treats, 2 for $5. Help a little," he repeated to those who passed by, most of them without paying him any attention. Arthur stopped to watch her for a moment. There was something about her that intrigued him. It wasn't just his disheveled appearance or the way he insisted on selling his products, but the spark of intelligence in his eyes. She was smart. I knew it right away. I could see him quickly sizing up each person he passed, adjusting his tone depending on who his target was. When a well-dressed man emerged from the cafe, she approached him with a forced smile. "Sir, buy some candy. They are to help me with my things." The man shook his head and continued walking, but the girl was not discouraged. He simply turned to the next person. Arthur approached slowly, still not knowing exactly what he was going to say. The girl glanced at him out of the corner of her eye and then straightened her posture, as if she knew she had found a potential client. "Do you want candy, sir?" "They're good, 2 for $5, he said quickly, showing a couple of brightly colored packages. Arthur, surprised by the firmness in his voice, didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a bill out of his wallet and handed it to her. "How many can I buy with this?" he inquired, his demeanor calm yet inquisitive. The girl glanced at the bill, her eyes momentarily widening before she quickly masked her surprise. "Everyone, sir." "You can keep the box if you wish," he responded, weighing the benefits of seizing the moment over haggling. Arthur offered a faint smile, yet refrained from taking the candy. "I didn't come for candy," he stated, slipping the bill back into his pocket. The girl frowned, perplexed. "Then why is he here?" she asked, stepping back slightly. Arthur inhaled deeply. "I have a proposal for you, something different. Do you have a moment to discuss it?" The girl regarded him with suspicion. "Depends. What is it that you desire?" "I promise, it's nothing to worry about," Arthur said reassuringly. "I would like you to act as if you are my daughter for a day. I will compensate you generously, far exceeding what you might make in weeks peddling sweets." The girl stared, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Act as if you are his daughter. What would motivate me to take that action?" Arthur paused to gather his thoughts before responding. "Let's say I'm looking for some companionship, and you appear to be appropriate for my vision. It's completely safe, with no hidden surprises. Just one day, and then you can return to your routine." With her arms crossed, she exuded an unmistakable air of suspicion. "And what do you gain from that?" "Peace," Arthur replied with genuine conviction. "There's something I'm longing for, but if it's not your preference, I completely understand. You can go." The girl fixed her gaze on him, attempting to decipher his motives. After a moment, he let out a heavy sigh. "If this is a trick, I'll find out, but I need the money. So, fine. One day." Arthur inclined his head and extended his hand. "What do they call you?" "Julia," she answered, giving his hand a quick shake. "What about you?" "Arthur." "All right, Julia, let's go. I'll lead you to a spot where we can begin anew." Julia trailed behind him warily as they entered the vehicle. The vehicle, while subtle, certainly caught the eye as it navigated the bustling streets of the city center. Julia sat in silence, gazing out the window. Their gaze was fixed on each twist and avenue they encountered. Arthur became aware of his anxiety. "There's no need for concern," he remarked, shattering the stillness. "It's only for a single day." She paused before replying. At long last, he posed the question. "What unfolds after that day?" Julia remained skeptical, yet chose not to press further. As the vehicle advanced, he started to ponder what this enigmatic figure was truly seeking. His instincts hinted at deeper motives behind the proposal, yet for the moment, he had no option but to proceed. The vehicle glided down the winding path, flanked by towering trees that guided the way to Arthur's grand estate. Julia, nestled in the back seat, gazed out the window, her expression a blend of wonder and wariness. "I'd never encountered a setting quite like that before." The homes in her neighborhood were modest and weathered, a stark juxtaposition to the edifice that loomed before her now. As the vehicle came to a halt before the front door, Julia felt a lump in her throat. She had accepted Arthur's proposal, yet the weight of her choice was only starting to dawn on her. Arthur exited the car ahead of her and faced her directly. "Ben, I'd like to share something with you," he said in a steady tone that aimed to express assurance. Julia, her skepticism lingering, cautiously opened the door and stepped through after him. As they ascended the steps to the front door, she found herself captivated by the intricate details. The sleek marble, the grand columns, and the stained glass windows that captured the fading light of the day. Stepping through was akin to crossing into an entirely different realm, one that felt utterly unfamiliar to him. As the door swung open, an elderly woman stood patiently in the hallway, awaiting their arrival. Her hair was elegantly arranged in a bun, and she donned a flawless uniform. His face reflected a lifetime of wisdom and dedication. "Donna Irene, I would like to introduce you to Julia. She will spend the day with us," Arthur remarked, his tone suggesting that having a girl in his mansion was perfectly ordinary. Donna Irene cast a swift, discerning glance at Julia. Initially, she remained silent, yet her expression unmistakably conveyed her discomfort with the situation. At last, he gave a subtle nod and shifted his gaze to Arthur. "Would you like me to whip up something extraordinary for dinner, sir?" "Not at this moment," he responded. "Initially, my priority is to ensure that Julia feels at ease. Guide him to his room." Julia's eyes fluttered open, a look of astonishment crossing her face. "A space? Just for me?" Arthur offered a faint smile. "Clear. It's not for long, but I want you to be comfortable while you're here." Donna Irene gestured for me to follow her. Julia, still processing everything that was happening, walked behind the woman. The hallway was long, with walls decorated with paintings and golden mirrors. Julia tried not to touch anything, fearing that something might break. Upon reaching the room, Donna Irene opened the door, revealing a space that looked like something out of a magazine. The bed was covered with a white duvet, the curtains were a soft tone, and a large closet occupied one of the walls. This is huge," Julia said, not knowing how to react. "It's just a room," Donna Irene responded dryly. "Mr. Menezes mentioned that comfort was key, and indeed, it seemed she would find it here." Julia nodded, sensing the lingering suspicion in the woman's gaze. Is there anything else you require? Donna Irene inquired, her tone suggesting she anticipated a negative response. Julia shook her head. No, thank you. This is good. The woman exited the room, leaving Julia in solitude for a brief moment. The girl perched on the edge of the bed, releasing a soft sigh that lingered in the air. He may not have grasped all of Arthur's motivations, yet he recognized the importance of seizing this chance. Something about all of this stirred a peculiar sensation within him, as if it were more than it appeared to be. Nevertheless, he chose to hold off on forming any conclusions. Before too much time had passed, Arthur came back in search of her. He had swapped his attire for something more relaxed, yet he still exuded an air of sophistication and elegance. Julia, please prepare yourself for dinner. Donna Irene is here to assist you with all your needs. Julia gazed at him, her expression one of utter disbelief. Are you prepared? Could you clarify what you mean by that? Arthur beamed. I hope you leave a positive impact. Today we're having a little dinner, and I want you to look like someone who belongs here. Julia wasn't used to being given orders like that, but she nodded. Shortly after, Donna Irene returned with a dress that was clearly not hers. This will look good on you, he said, handing her the garment. Julia changed silently, and when she looked in the mirror, she could barely recognize herself. The dress was elegant but simple, and although she didn't feel completely comfortable, she knew it was part of the deal. When she came back out into the hallway, Arthur was waiting for her. He looked at her with a mixture of approval and something he couldn't quite define. You look good, he commented. Now let's go to the living room. Dinner was served in a dining room that seemed designed for grand events. There were candelabras, china, and a table that could seat more than 20 people, even though it was just the two of them. Julia sat across from Arthur, feeling small compared to everything around her. During dinner, Arthur tried to start a conversation. Tell me, Julia, what do you like to do when you're not selling candy? The girl glanced up from her plate. I don't have much time for anything else. Caring for my brother occupies most of my day. Arthur nodded, intrigued. Do you have a brother? How old are you, Dot? 7, Julia said, a subtle smile playing on her lips as she recalled him. He goes by the name Miguel. It's beneficial at school, even if it's not always within our budget. Julia's words struck a chord with Arthur more than he anticipated. He recalled the days of his youth, when he too had to struggle to forge his path. Even though he had laid those memories to rest, they resurfaced with a fierce intensity, prompting him to reevaluate numerous choices he had made in the past. Julia appeared to be meticulously watching Arthur's every response. I was more than just a girl responding to inquiries. He was dissecting the scenario, assessing what benefits he could derive from it all. She accepted the deal out of necessity, yet she understood the importance of being vigilant. And what about your parents? Arthur inquired, almost unconsciously. Julia cast her gaze downward. They aren't present, he answered plainly. Arthur recognized that he ought not to press the issue, yet there was an element in his reply that felt unfinished, as though he were concealing something. He chose to set the topic aside for now, yet he couldn't dispel the sense that Julia's narrative held deeper layers than she was revealing. As they wrapped up their dinner, Donna Irene entered to gather the plates. He gazed at Julia again, this time with a heightened sense of curiosity. Even in silence, his distrust of the girl was palpable, and he seemed determined to uncover more about her. Arthur, in his own way, chose to bring the evening to a close. Julia marked a promising beginning. Tomorrow we'll see how we continue, Julia felt, grateful to have a moment to be alone. But as he headed to his room, he couldn't help but wonder if Arthur really knew what he had gotten himself into. She wasn't just a needy girl. She had her own plans and was determined to make the most of this opportunity. The next morning, the mansion woke up with its usual calm, but there was a different energy in the air. Julia, still uncomfortable in that luxurious environment, went down the stairs slowly, observing every detail of the place. The carpet that covered the steps was so soft that it seemed strange to step on it, as if he were walking on something too expensive to be used. As he approached the hallway, he heard voices coming from Arthur's office. He stopped in the hallway and, without anyone noticing, strained his ears. "Arthur, this is completely absurd," said a firm, annoying voice. "What were you thinking bringing an unknown girl into your home, much less in the middle of a decision as delicate as the will?" Julia, curious, carefully poked her head out to see who was speaking. He was a man of about 50, dressed impeccably in a dark gray suit. He had a folder in his hand and seemed to be clearly upset. "Alvaro, I understand your concerns, but I have already made my decision. Julia is here on my terms." "There's nothing more to discuss about that," Arthur replied calmly, although his tone showed that he was unwilling to justify himself further. "Your terms? Arthur, this girl could be anything. Don't you realize the risk you're taking? What if he has other intentions? What if someone else is behind this?" Alvaro replied, visibly frustrated. Arthur let out a heavy sigh. "Listen to me, Alvaro. I am fully aware of what I do, and I will tell you this for the last time. I'm not going to discuss this issue with you." Julia felt that her presence in the mansion was causing more problems than she had anticipated. She backed slowly down the hallway before they saw her, but she couldn't help but wonder how far the man's suspicions went. Alvaro clearly did not trust her, and that could complicate her stay. Later, when Julia was in the main room, Alvaro appeared at the entrance. He watched her for a moment before approaching, his expression neutral, but with a look that conveyed question. "So you're Julia," he said as if he were sizing her up. "I am Alvaro, Arthur's lawyer." Julia looked at him without flinching. "Hello," he responded simply, trying not to show any emotion that might give away his own thoughts. Alvaro studied her carefully, noting her careful manners and somewhat rigid posture. "Where do you come from, Julia? Arthur didn't tell me much about you." "From the center," she responded without giving details. He knew that any additional information could be used against him, so he limited himself to the essentials. "And how did you end up here?" The question was direct, but his tone was not friendly. Alvaro wanted answers. "He asked me to come." Julia answered with a naturalness that contrasted with the tension of the moment. "He said he needed company." Alvaro was not satisfied with that answer, however he decided not to pressure her further, at least for the moment. But as he walked away, he made a mental note. Investigate more about that girl. There was something about her that didn't fit her. Meanwhile, Arthur was meeting with Donna Irene in the kitchen. The woman, always direct, was also uneasy with Julia's presence. "Sir, I understand that you want to help, but Alvaro has a point. We don't know anything about this girl." Arthur looked at her patiently. "I trust my instinct, Irene, and I don't need anyone else to understand it." Donna Irene, although respectful, could not help but mutter something under her breath before returning to her tasks. She had also noticed that Julia seemed overly interested in certain details of the house, as if she were studying the place, rather than simply enjoying her stay. Later, Julia took advantage of a quiet moment to explore the mansion further. He passed by Arthur's office, looking at the shelves full of books and folders. Something in that room told him that important secrets were kept there. However, he did not have time to investigate further, as he heard footsteps approaching and quickly left the place. In the dining room, Arthur and Alvaro resumed their conversation, this time with less tension. Arthur tried to change the subject to the will, but Alvaro continued to insist on security. "I only ask that you be careful, Arthur. I don't want you to regret it after this." "I will have it, Alvaro, but I ask you to trust me for once." Julia passed by enough to catch fragments of the conversation, and although she did not fully understand what they were discussing, she knew that the lawyer was not going to leave the topic easily. She decided to remain vigilant, as she sensed that Alvaro would soon try to discover more about her. As the day progressed, Julia continued to observe the mansion's employees. I paid attention to the schedules, to how everyone moved around the house. Although he didn't show it, he was creating a mental map of the place and the people. It wasn't out of pointless curiosity. I knew this information could be useful later. That evening, when she joined Arthur for dinner, Julia decided to ask some questions. Why is Alvaro so worried about me? He barely knows me. Arthur looked up from his plate, surprised by the girl's candor. Alvaro has always been protective of me. It is their nature to distrust. And you, don't you distrust? Julia looked directly at him, her tone calm but inquisitive. Arthur took a moment before answering. I trust what I feel. And, for now, I feel like I made the right decision. Julia didn't insist, but something in her eyes showed that there were still many things she didn't understand about Arthur, just as he didn't understand about her. They were both playing a game, although for different purposes. As night fell over the mansion, Julia realized she had to be more careful. Alvaro represented a direct threat to his stay there, and he could not afford to make mistakes. But what he didn't know was that the lawyer had already started investigating. That same night, from his office, Alvaro made some calls, determined to discover who that girl who had suddenly appeared in Arthur's life really was. However, Alvaro was not the only one with plans. Julia, as she lay on the bed, continued to think of her next move. She knew she couldn't let her guard down, especially now that suspicions about her were beginning to grow. But he also knew that, somehow, he had to gain Arthur's trust completely before Alvaro could ruin everything. Night had fallen on the mansion, covering everything with a silence that was only broken by the slight rustling of the branches moved by the wind. Arthur was in his study, as usual, going through papers that seemed important, but barely held his attention. Since Julia had arrived, he had noticed his mind wandering more frequently. The girl represented something new in his life, something that he didn't fully understand, but that kept him curious. Julia, for her part, was sitting in the large living room, playing with a pen she had found on a nearby table. Although he had only spent a full day in that place, he was beginning to get used to the surroundings, but he knew that his stay there was not permanent. While looking at the detailed decoration of the place, Arthur appeared at the entrance. Are you comfortable here, Julia? He asked in a neutral tone, although there was genuine interest in his voice. Julia looked up and nodded. It's more than I'm used to. Arthur walked over and sat on the couch across from her. I wanted to talk to you. There is something that intrigues me. Julia watched him silently, waiting for him to continue. Arthur took a breath before asking his question. Tell me, Julia, what are you dreaming about? What would you really like to have or do? Julia didn't respond immediately. His fingers continued to play with the pen as he seemed to consider his words. Finally he looked up. I don't dream about things for myself. What I want is for my brother to be happy. The answer surprised Arthur. I didn't expect a girl her age to think so little of herself. How old is your brother? 7, Julia said, with a slight flash of emotion in her eyes at the mention of it. His name is Miguel. It's special. He is always looking for reasons to smile, even if we don't have much. Arthur nodded, intrigued. And what makes Miguel happy? Julia smiled slightly, although her gaze darkened a little. Miguel wants a mother. He always asks me why we don't have one. I tell him it doesn't matter, we have each other, but he doesn't understand. Arthur remained silent. Julia's words hit him in a way he didn't expect. For years he had avoided thinking about human connections, about what it meant to have a family, but that girl's words were forcing him to face those thoughts again. And what do you do to take care of him? He finally asked. Julia sighed. Everything I can. We sell candy together, but I try not to be on the street for too long. He's small and I don't want him to see things he shouldn't. Arthur nodded slowly, admiring Julia's maturity and determination. However, something didn't quite add up. Tell me something, Julia. Why did you choose me? There are many people in this city, but you agreed to come here. Because? The question left Julia silent for a moment. His eyes drifted to the ground, as if he were searching for the right words. Finally she looked directly at him. It wasn't a coincidence. I knew who you were before you spoke to me. Arthur sat up straight, surprised by the confession. Did you know who he was? Julia hesitated, but decided there was no point in lying. Miguel and I heard people talking about you on the street. They said he was rich, but also that he was alone. I thought that if anyone could help us, it would be someone who understood what it's like to have no one. Arthur stayed silent, processing Julia's words. There was a sincerity in her that disarmed him, but also something that he couldn't quite decipher. So you came here with a purpose, he finally said. Yes, Julia admitted without looking away, but it wasn't to take advantage of you. I just wanted to give Miguel a chance to dream of something better. In that moment Arthur felt a connection to Julia that he hadn't felt in years. Her honesty and determination touched him, but also left him with more questions. Before he could formulate them, a subtle noise interrupted them. They both turned their heads towards the entrance of the living room, where Donna Irene was standing, with a tray in her hands. Sorry to interrupt, sir, the woman said, although her tone and posture made it clear that she had heard more than she cared to admit. Arthur nodded slowly. Okay, Irene, leave us. Donna Irene left the tray on the table and left, but not without casting one last look at Julia. Something in the woman's expression made it clear that she was not done with her doubts. Arthur, however, turned his attention to Julia. Thank you for telling me the truth, he finally said. It's not always easy to be honest. Julia nodded, although she did not respond. She knew she had shared more than she wanted, but she also knew that she needed Arthur to trust her if she wanted to follow through with her plan. Meanwhile, Donna Irene returned to the kitchen, where she began to prepare tea. However, his mind was far from the task. The words he had heard between Arthur and Julia echoed in his head. Determined to get answers, she decided to investigate more about the girl. Although he respected Arthur's decisions, he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more behind all of this. That night, after Julia retired to her room, Donna Irene went to Arthur's office. She knocked on the door and entered when he gave her permission. Sir, can I talk to you for a moment? Arthur, who was looking through some papers, looked up. Of course, Irene. What happens? The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. I heard part of what he said with Julia. I want to make sure you know what you're getting into. Arthur watched her calmly. I know what I'm doing, Irene. Julia is not a threat. I'm not saying this as a threat, sir, but there are things we don't know about her. What if there is something in his past that could harm him? You have worked your entire life to get here. I don't want all that to be lost by trusting too quickly. Arthur sighed. I understand your concerns, but I trust Julia. She has been honest with me. Donna Irene nodded, although she did not seem completely convinced. I'm just asking you to be careful, sir. Things are not always what they seem. Arthur smiled slightly. Thank you, Irene. I always appreciate your loyalty. The woman left the office, but her decision had already been made. If Arthur wasn't going to investigate Julia further, she would. Not because he completely distrusted the girl, but because he wanted to protect the man he had served for so many years. That night, while the rest of the mansion slept, Donna Irene began making some calls, determined to discover who Julia really was and what she was hiding in her past. Life in Arthur's mansion went on with the usual superficial tranquility, although beneath that calm new threads of intrigue were beginning to be woven. While Julia moved through the hallways and gardens, observing every corner and understanding how everything worked, she did not realize that she was also being watched. From the neighboring house, a young photographer named Lucas spent much of his time with a camera in hand, exploring the world through the lens. Lucas had lived next to Arthur's mansion his entire life, but he had rarely seen anything interesting there. The property was a static place, with the same old employees coming and going, and the owner almost always locked in his study or absent. However, the last few days had brought something different. From his room, Lucas had noticed the arrival of an unknown girl. His movements in the gardens, his way of interacting with Arthur, and especially his curious attitude of observation, had awakened his attention. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Lucas adjusted his camera lens and pointed it toward the mansion. Through his bedroom window, he captured images of Julia walking near a fence that delimited the land. She seemed distracted, but something in the way she looked around told him she was analyzing more than she was letting on. Lucas, intrigued, began taking photographs, capturing every gesture. Julia felt like someone was watching her. It was a feeling he had developed after years on the streets, where being alert could mean the difference between safety and danger. He turned his head slowly and saw a flash from the window of the neighboring house. He pursed his lips and walked towards the fence, pretending not to have noticed anything, but when he got close, he looked directly at the young man holding the camera. "What are you doing?" Julia asked out loud, making Lucas almost drop the camera. Lucas lowered the device and smiled nervously. "Nothing, well, just taking photos, that's what I do." Julia crossed her arms, staying on the other side of the fence. "Do you always take photos of people without permission?" "Not always," Lucas admitted, lowering his gaze a little, "but you're not like the people who are normally there." It made me curious. Curious about what? Julia wasn't upset, but she wanted to know how much he had seen. "About you. You don't seem like the type of person to live in a mansion like that and... Well, I noticed that you also observe a lot, like you're studying something." Julia sighed, weighing her options on whether to engage with him or simply brush him off. Yet, there was an air of curiosity in Lucas's demeanor that felt disarming rather than menacing. "I'm only here for a while." "Nothing that matters to you." Lucas leaned over the fence slightly, eager to glean more information. "Why are you here, then? Are you related to Arthur, or something?" "Not exactly," Julia replied, sidestepping the question. "And you always keep an eye on your neighbors?" Lucas chuckled lightly. "I don't keep an eye, I just observe. It's different. Photography is a means of grasping what remains unspoken." Julia arched an eyebrow, still not entirely convinced. "And what do you think you grasp about me?" Lucas was silent for a moment, thinking about his answer. "I think you're here for more than what you say, but I don't see it as a bad thing, it just seems important." Julia didn't respond immediately. Lucas's words worried her, not because he was wrong, but because he was right more than she expected. He decided to divert the conversation. "And you? Don't you have anything better to do?" "Maybe," Lucas said with a shrug, "but this is more interesting. Also, I saw something last night that, well, I guess you might want to know." Julia looked up, now genuinely interested. "What did you see?" "There was a woman near the mansion. I don't know who it was, but it didn't look like someone who worked there. He walked as if he were looking for something, or someone." Julia felt a knot in her stomach. He tried to stay calm, but his hands tightened slightly against the fence. "What time was it?" "Late, after midnight. I couldn't sleep, so I was looking out the window. I saw her for a few minutes before she disappeared. She didn't seem to want to be seen." "What was she like?" Julia asked, trying to sound casual. Lucas frowned as he tried to remember the details. "Dark hair, simple clothes, not very tall." He walked carefully, as if he didn't want to make noise. Julia nodded slowly, although her mind was already working at full speed. He knew exactly who it could be, but he couldn't let Lucas know. He feigned disinterest. "It must be someone from the surroundings. I don't think it's anything." "Maybe," Lucas answered, although he didn't seem convinced. "But if you need to know more, I can always help you. I'm good at observing things." Julia looked at him with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "And why would you do that?" Because I like to understand what's happening, Lucas said with a light smile. Besides, I find you interesting. I think you're here for something important. Julia didn't respond, but something in her expression softened the conversation. Although she didn't completely trust him, she also couldn't ignore that Lucas could be an unexpected ally. Without saying more, he said goodbye and returned to the mansion, leaving Lucas with his camera and his theories. When Julia entered the house again, she found Donna Irene watching her from the kitchen door. The woman didn't say anything, but her eyes were like daggers that seemed to want to pierce any secret Julia might have. Julia, showing no emotion, continued towards her room. That night, as she sat on her bed, Julia thought about her conversation with Lucas and the woman who had been seen near the mansion. He knew there were things Arthur wasn't supposed to discover, at least not yet. Determined to protect her plan, she made a mental list of what she had to do to prevent the pieces from starting to fall out of her control. On the other side of the fence, Lucas was still looking at the photos he had taken. Intrigued by the mystery that seemed to surround Julia. Unknowingly, both of them were more connected than they could imagine, and the decisions they made in the coming days would have consequences that neither of them could foresee. The morning arrived calmly in the mansion, but Donna Irene had spent a restless night. Julia's words, her silences and evasions, had been running through his head, and something inside told him that he should act. She was a meticulous woman, used to maintaining control in her surroundings, and Julia's presence altered that order in a way that she could not ignore. In her free time, Donna Irene had begun to discreetly inquire about the girl. She made some calls to contacts in the city, people who knew the dynamics of the most humble neighborhoods, and little by little she put together a clearer picture of Julia's life. One piece of information in particular surprised her. Julia lived in a makeshift shelter with other children, including her little brother, Miguel. That was not a total surprise, but confirming the precariousness of his situation generated a conflict. It wasn't that Donna Irene lacked compassion, but she feared that this reality might mean that Julia was manipulating Arthur. That same day, after Julia went out to the garden, Donna Irene decided to confront Arthur. He found him in his office, reviewing some documents. He entered without asking permission, something he rarely did, and Arthur looked up, surprised by his attitude. "Irene, is something wrong?" he asked, putting the papers aside. The woman took a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Menezes, I need to talk to you about Julia." Arthur watched her with interest. "What's wrong with her?" "I discovered something about your situation." He started with a serious tone. "Julia doesn't live alone. He is in a makeshift shelter with other children, including his younger brother. It's a difficult situation, but I'm worried that it might mean she has other reasons for being here." Arthur remained silent for a moment. "What are you suggesting, Irene?" "I just want you to be careful. This girl is in a desperate situation, and although I understand why she wants to help her, we cannot ignore that there may be a hidden interest. I could be manipulating him." Arthur stood up from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the garden where Julia was sitting. There was something about her that inspired confidence, but he also knew that Irene was rarely wrong in her observations. Still, there was something he needed to understand better. "Thank you for telling me, Irene," he finally said, "but instead of assuming, I think it's time for me to find out for myself. Take me to that shelter." Donna Irene was surprised. "Are you sure, sir? It's not a suitable place for someone like you." "All the more reason to go," Arthur replied firmly. "I want to see with my own eyes where Julia comes from." A couple of hours later, Arthur was in the car, accompanied by Donna Irene, heading to the place she had mentioned. The journey took him to a part of the city that he had not visited in decades, a neighborhood where the streets were dusty and the houses, built with what the inhabitants could find, seemed to barely stand. The contrast with his mansion was overwhelming, and Arthur felt a pang of discomfort as he realized how out of touch he was with many people's reality. When they arrived at the shelter, Arthur got out of the car with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. The place was nothing more than a rundown house, with broken windows covered by cardboard, and a door that barely closed. In the front yard, some children were playing with balls made of old clothes, while others simply watched from the corners, as if they were used to not trusting strangers. Julia, who was inside, was surprised to see Arthur enter. She ran towards him, clearly confused. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. "I want to meet Miguel," Arthur answered calmly. Julia stared at him, evaluating whether she could trust him to enter the fragile world she was trying to protect. Finally, she sighed and led him to a room in the back. There, a little boy was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers and colored pencils, drawing clumsy but lively figures. "Miguel, this is Arthur," Julia said softly, "the man I told you about." Miguel looked up, his eyes shining with curiosity. He stood up quickly and extended his hand with an innocent smile. "Hello, Mr. Arthur." Arthur, surprised by the boy's warmth, shook his hand. "Hello, Miguel. It's a pleasure to meet you." Miguel looked at him with a mixture of shyness and excitement. "Is it true that you have a big house?" "Julia says it's huge like a castle." Arthur smiled slightly. "Well, it's quite big, but I don't know if it's as big as a castle." Miguel seemed fascinated. "Do you have a garden? And big trees?" "I would like to have a tree to climb." Julia silently watched his face, showing a mixture of relief and concern. Arthur, on the other hand, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A genuine connection. There was something in the way Miguel spoke, in the way he saw the world, that reminded him of himself as a child. "Give me, Miguel, what else do you like to do?" Arthur asked, interested in keeping the conversation going. "I like to draw and listen to stories. Julia always tells me bedtime stories, but I think she makes some up because I haven't seen them in any books." Arthur laughed softly. "Maybe one day I can tell you some stories too." Miguel applauded enthusiastically. "Really? That would be amazing." While the two talked, Julia watched carefully. Although he still didn't completely trust Arthur's intentions, he couldn't deny that there was something different about him. Her interest in Miguel seemed genuine, and for the first time she felt that perhaps she had made the right decision in trusting him. When it was time to leave, Miguel ran up to Arthur and hugged him without warning. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Arthur. I hope you come back soon." Arthur, visibly moved, stroked the boy's head. "I'll be back, Miguel. I promise you." On the way back, Mrs. Irene watched Arthur from the passenger seat. "What do you think now, sir?" Arthur sighed, looking out the window. "I think there is more to Julia and Miguel than I imagined, and I think I want to be part of their story, in some way." Donna Irene, although still with reservations, could not help but feel touched by Arthur's words. For the first time in years he saw a sparkle in her eyes that he thought had disappeared forever. Arthur couldn't stop thinking about the shelter and the time he spent with Miguel. Something about that boy, in his smile and the way he spoke, reminded him of a longing he had ignored for years. Julia's words also continued to run through his mind, the sincerity with which she had spoken about protecting her brother, his maturity beyond his years. That night, as he looked out his study window, Arthur made a decision that would change the course of things. Julia and Miguel deserved better, and he could do something about it. The next morning he summoned Alvaro to the mansion. The lawyer arrived early, as always, impeccably dressed and with a folder in his hand. He was used to dealing with Arthur's eccentricities, but he wasn't prepared for what the millionaire was about to announce. "Alvaro, I need you to adjust my will," Arthur said bluntly, as they both sat in the office. Alvaro looked up from the document he was reviewing. "What kind of adjustment, Arthur?" "I want to include Julia and her brother Miguel. I want them to have access to a part of my inheritance when I'm gone." The lawyer blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. "Arthur, do you realize what you're saying? You barely know that girl. How can you be sure he has no other intentions?" Arthur crossed his arms, staying calm. "I know her well enough to know that she has no one else to trust. And Miguel, he deserves a chance. This is not negotiable, Alvaro. Alvaro put the folder on the table and leaned forward, his tone hardening. Arthur, I can't support this. Not only are you putting your legacy at risk, but you could be the victim of a scam. Please think the best. I don't need you to support my decision, Alvaro. I just need you to fulfill it, Arthur replied firmly. The tension in the room was palpable. Alvaro took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. Arthur, I have been with you for decades. My job is to protect you, even from yourself. This decision is not reasonable. Arthur gently tapped the table with his palm, a subtle but clear sign that he wasn't going to give in. You said it yourself, Alvaro. You've been with me for decades. And you know I don't make decisions lightly. This is what I want, and I need you to do it. The lawyer stared at him, trying to find some crack in his resolve, but found none. Finally, he stood up and picked up the folder. I will, but I must warn you that this may have consequences. I hope you don't regret it. Arthur nodded without looking away. Thank you, Alvaro. That will be all for now. As Alvaro exited the office, Julia walked through the hallway and caught sight of his strained expression. She was unable to catch the words exchanged, yet an instinct whispered that the conversation revolved around her and Miguel. He chose to hold back his inquiry, at least for the moment, yet that observation lingered in his thoughts. In the adjacent house, Lucas persisted in examining the photographs he had captured over the past few days. A specific image drew his focus, an indistinct silhouette by the mansion, captured under the cover of darkness. Lucas magnified the image and endeavored to enhance it to the best of his ability. Even though he couldn't discern every detail, there was something about the silhouette that struck a chord of familiarity. He resolved to delve deeper into the matter. Lucas stepped out of his house and made his way to a nearby coffee shop, intrigued by whispers of a woman who had been seen lingering there. There, after posing a few subtle inquiries, he encountered a name that left him bewildered. Carmen. The woman had a reputation in the neighborhood for her quest to find someone, though she never revealed precisely who that person was. The depiction aligned perfectly with the image captured in the photograph. At the mansion, Julia tended to the garden when Lucas appeared at the fence, beckoning her with a wave. She rose and moved forward, embodying a blend of intrigue and wariness. I discovered something, Lucas murmured, revealing the image on his camera. Are you familiar with this woman? Julia gazed at the image, her expression tightening just a bit, though she made an effort to conceal it. No. I'm uncertain about their identity. Lucas observed her intently. Are you certain? I came across the name Carmen, and it seems she's been on the lookout for someone. It might hold significance. Julia shook her head, though her voice lacked conviction. It's not my concern. Lucas chose not to press the issue, yet there was an unmistakable hint in Julia's response that suggested she was holding back more than she let on. He chose to hold on to the information for the time being, yet he had no intention of letting the subject fade away. That evening, Arthur summoned Julia to his office. The girl stepped inside, her heart racing, pondering the words she wished to express. Arthur, nestled in his armchair, regarded her with a gaze that blended gravity and affection. Julia, I've come to a conclusion regarding you and Miguel, he started, allowing a moment for her to absorb his statement. I desire their safety and security. That is the reason I have incorporated them into my will. Julia gazed at him, her expression a mix of astonishment and uncertainty, unsure of how to respond. What does that signify? It signifies that when I am no longer here, a portion of what I possess will be left for you, enabling you to create a brighter future. Julia experienced a swirl of feelings, thankfulness, uncertainty, and most prominently, an unexpected burden of responsibility. I'm at a loss for words. No need for words, Arthur said, a faint smile playing on his lips. I want you to understand that I have complete faith in you. Julia nodded slowly, yet she was aware that this would complicate matters. He arrived at the mansion with a clear intention, yet he was taken aback by how near Arthur had approached. At this moment, she needed to exercise caution like never before. As Julia departed from the office, Alvaro came back with the revised document in hand. Even though he remained unconvinced, he understood that altering Arthur's choice was beyond his reach. Yet, beneath the surface, he was resolute in his pursuit of uncovering the truth about Julia and her brother. If anything was concealed, he would uncover it. In a quiet corner of the city, Carmen gazed at a faded photograph capturing the innocence of two children. His expression conveyed a blend of sorrow and resolve. He had journeyed too far to turn back now. The hidden truths he bore were on the verge of revelation, poised to transform everything Arthur, Julia, and Miguel believed they understood. The ambience in the mansion thickened, as though the events of the past few days had started to bear down on all present. Arthur sensed a shift in Julia, as though the barrier he had constructed around his history was starting to fracture. The girl held a quiet demeanor, and while she engaged in daily activities, she made sure not to remain silent with him for extended periods. Yet, Arthur understood that the time to confront the truth was unavoidable. That evening, following dinner, Arthur summoned her to the office. Julia lingered at the threshold, a moment of uncertainty washing over her, yet she ultimately stepped inside, gently shutting the door behind her. Arthur sat in his chair, elbows propped on the desk, hands intertwined before his face. His gaze held a serene quality, yet it was imbued with an unwavering resolve that Julia found impossible to overlook. "Julia," he started, his voice a blend of warmth and gravity, "there's an unspoken matter between us, something I sense you're holding on to, and I believe it's time to bring it to light." Julia met his gaze, striving to keep her emotions in check. "I anticipated that moment arriving, yet I was unprepared for its swift approach." "I have no idea what you're referring to," he responded, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Arthur inclined his head ever so slightly, his gaze unwavering from hers. "You're aware of it. From the moment you stepped into this space, I've sensed that there's a depth to you that goes beyond your words. Please share your thoughts with me." Julia folded her arms tightly, a gesture that seemed to shield her from the impending words that loomed ahead. "Understood. Here it is, the truth you seek. I recognized you even before our paths crossed on the street." The admission enveloped the room in a profound stillness. Arthur remained unfazed, though a subtle shift in his expression revealed a hint of resolve. "What gave it away?" "Since my mother was employed by you," Julia stated, her tone resolute yet tinged with unspoken feelings. "A long time ago. You held the position of owner at the company where she served as a secretary. Yet, on a particular day, an event unfolded. She lost her job unexpectedly, with no explanation or clear reasons given, and from that moment, everything started to unravel for us." Arthur experienced a tightening in his gut, yet he allowed her to proceed. "We lost our home due to our inability to afford it. My mother sought employment, yet she often remarked that the specter of her dismissal lingered over her. She was forever changed. And ultimately, when circumstances took a turn for the worse, he fell ill. I was young, yet the memories are vivid and clear. I recall the nights filled with his tears, the way he struggled to keep us all above water. He passed away while Miguel was just an infant. Since that moment, we have found ourselves in solitude." Arthur shut his eyes briefly, attempting to absorb the weight of what he had just learned. As he opened his eyes, Julia noticed a depth in his gaze that she had never encountered before. "Why didn't you inform me earlier?" he inquired, his tone now subdued. Julia shrugged, even as tears began to well up in her eyes. "Initially, I arrived with the intention of facing him directly. I wished for him to understand the consequences of his actions, the way he shattered our lives. However, I encountered him, and Miguel did as well. And I came to understand that it was far more complex. I found it hard to fully dislike it, as, for the first time, there was someone ready to lend us a hand." Arthur reclined in his chair, a heavy sensation pressing down on his chest that he found impossible to dismiss. He recalled the years spent constructing his empire, the choices he had taken, the sacrifices he had required from others, all without pausing to consider the repercussions. Yet, he could never have foreseen that one of those choices would lead to such significant repercussions. "I apologize," he finally said, his tone carrying a weight of sincerity that Julia hadn't anticipated. "I take full responsibility for what transpired. Perhaps I was unaware of what your mother was experiencing back then, yet that doesn't alter the reality that I contributed to her pain." Julia took her time before replying. "I anticipated a variety of outcomes from that conversation, but those words were not among them." A part of her began to soften, yet there remained a great deal to mend. "What actions will you take now that you have this knowledge?" he inquired, his tone softened. Arthur gazed at her with unwavering resolve. "I will make every effort to mend the harm done. While the past is beyond my control, I can ensure that you and Miguel embark on a different journey ahead." Julia nodded slowly, sensing for the first time that perhaps there was a path beyond all of this. However, the dialogue continued beyond that point. "There's an additional detail you should be aware of," Arthur remarked. "What transpired with your mother? I didn't do it on purpose, but that's beside the point. What truly counts is my desire to uncover all there is to know. If there's anything more you haven't shared, now is the moment to do so." Julia paused for a moment, then finally found her voice. "The woman Lucas spotted near the mansion seems to be someone familiar with my mother. I'm uncertain about his identity, yet he could possess insights that even elude me." Arthur nodded, his thoughts racing with intensity. "Then we'll find her. However, Julia, it's important for you to grasp something. What you uncover holds no significance. My dedication to you and Miguel remains steadfast." Julia felt a profound connection to Arthur's words. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally sensed that someone was truly in his corner. "Not because I have to, but because I want to." That evening, as Arthur sifted through aged papers, seeking any clues that could illuminate Julia's mother's history, a fresh resolve enveloped him. He was unable to alter his past actions, yet he could ensure that those errors did not shape his current reality. In her room, Julia reclined beside Miguel, who was already lost in slumber, allowing her tears to cascade down her cheeks in quiet solitude. For the first time, he permitted himself to experience emotions he had long suppressed. Anticipation. The air in the mansion had grown increasingly charged in recent days. Donna Irene, once a paragon of serenity and composure, now navigated the home with palpable discomfort. Conversely, Alvaro had ramped up his visits, growing ever more suspicious of Julia and Miguel's presence. While Arthur appeared resolute in his efforts to safeguard the children, an unspoken understanding lingered between them, acknowledging that certain elements remained puzzling. The allure of the unknown compelled them to reach a collective conclusion. Delve deeper. One afternoon, as Arthur immersed himself in the review of documents in his office, Irene and Alvaro found themselves in the kitchen, an unlikely setting for their clandestine meeting. Irene poured the tea as Alvaro retrieved a folder brimming with notes and documents he had meticulously gathered. "I discovered something concerning," Alvaro started, sliding the folder across to Irene. "It appears that Julia and Miguel have been facing some pressure from a man. He refers to himself as their father, yet there is no definitive proof of this claim. What is evident, however, is his persistent demand for money from them." Irene delicately picked up the folder and started to peruse its contents. As he pressed on, his demeanor grew more resolute. "This is illogical. If he truly is their father, why isn't he looking after them instead of demanding money from them?" "Precisely," replied Alvaro. "According to my sources, this individual has been exploiting children to acquire resources. Upon discovering their association with Arthur, it appeared he recognized an even greater opportunity." Irene placed the folder on the table with a resolute motion. "We cannot allow this to persist, yet if we inform Arthur, he may act too rashly." "I concur," Alvaro replied, nodding thoughtfully. "However, we won't be able to keep it from him for much longer. If we manage this properly, he could seize control of the situation before it spirals out of control." That same night, after ensuring Julia and Miguel were fast asleep, Irene and Alvaro made their way to Arthur's office. The millionaire observed them with keen interest as they walked in together, sensing that a significant moment was on the horizon. "Arthur, do you have any questions?" Alvaro started, placing the folder on the desk. "This concerns Julia and Miguel." Arthur frowned, clearly on high alert. "What's the matter with them?" Irene asked, her voice steady yet filled with worry. "It has come to our attention that a man is asserting he is the biological father. He has been extorting money from them, and according to our understanding, he has been exploiting them for his own gain." Arthur inhaled deeply, attempting to process the revelation. "Do you have any evidence to support this?" Alvaro asked as he opened the folder, revealing photos, records, and testimonies gathered by his contacts. "We may not have all the answers, but what we do know is enough to cause concern. This individual may attempt to draw near to you, Arthur. Preparation is essential." Arthur gazed at the documents in quiet contemplation for a few moments before standing up from his chair. "If this man wishes to speak with me, he may do so, but not according to his conditions, rather according to mine." Irene regarded him with worry. "What does that mean, sir?" "Invite him here," Arthur replied, his calm demeanor surprising them both. "I wish to meet him in person. I'm eager to listen to your thoughts, but I need to clarify something as well. I refuse to let him control these children or meddle in their lives." Alvaro and Irene shared a look of astonishment, but ultimately agreed. It was understood that once Arthur reached a conclusion, there would be no turning back. 2 days later, the gentleman made his entrance at the grand estate. He stood tall, exuding a nonchalant vibe, his smile lacking any hint of assurance. Julia caught sight of him from the window and instantly felt a surge of tension. He understood his identity and the significance of his presence. She hurried to the living room where Arthur awaited her presence. "What brings you here?" he inquired, his voice quivering just a bit. "I need to grasp the situation, Julia," Arthur said, gently resting his hand on her shoulder. "I won't allow anyone to cause you pain. Trust me." Julia remained silent, her eyes betraying a blend of fear and gratitude. Arthur approached the front door, opening it with an air of unshakable composure. "Arthur Menezes," the man introduced himself, extending a hand that Arthur chose to disregard. "Thank you for having me." "Come in," Arthur replied, his tone lacking any warmth. The man stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the mansion with evident curiosity. "It's an impressive place," he remarked, his smile attempting to convey friendliness. "I'm sure Julia and Miguel are enjoying this." Arthur held his tongue for a moment, leading the man straight to the office. Irene and Alvaro were already there, their eyes locked on the unexpected guest. Arthur settled behind his desk and motioned toward a chair opposite him. "Tell me, what do you want?" he asked bluntly. The man shrugged. "I only want what is fair. They are my children, and I think I deserve some of what you are giving them." "Do you have proof that they are your children?" Arthur asked, his tone cold and calculating. The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't need proof. They know who I am. Julia can tell you that I am her father." Arthur turned his gaze to Julia, who was in the corner of the room, watching with a mixture of fear and determination. "Julia, is what she says true?" Julia took a deep breath before speaking. "He is our biological father, but he has never been there for us. He only comes when he needs something." The man tried to interrupt, but Arthur raised a hand stopping him. "That's enough. Now I know what I need to know." He stood up from his chair and leaned slightly towards the man. "I don't know who you really are, but this is what I'm going to tell you. Julia and Miguel are under my care now. If you have any intention of using them for your benefit, I assure you that I will not allow it. If you try to approach them without my consent, you will have much bigger problems than you can handle." The man remained silent, clearly surprised by Arthur's firmness. After a few moments, he stood up from his chair and nodded, although his fake smile was still on his face. "Understood, Mr. Menezes. We don't want problems." When the man left, Arthur closed the door behind him and looked at Julia. "This doesn't end here, Julia. But as long as I'm here, no one is going to hurt you. I promise you that." Julia nodded slowly, her eyes filled with unshed tears. For the first time, she felt that someone was really willing to fight for her and for Miguel. The meeting with Julia and Miguel's supposed father left palpable tension in the mansion. Arthur could not ignore the discomfort that the man's presence had caused, especially in Julia. Although his reaction had been contained, Arthur had noticed the slight tremor in his hands and how he avoided meeting the man's gaze. Something didn't add up, and he was determined to find out the truth. That same night, while reviewing the documents that Alvaro and Irene had collected, Arthur felt that there were missing pieces to the puzzle. Although the records pointed to the man having some connection with the children, there was nothing conclusive that confirmed his relationship as a father. He decided to look for someone who could help him from another angle. The next morning, Arthur called Lucas, who had been following the movements in the mansion, with peculiar interest. Lucas arrived shortly after, with his camera on his shoulder and evident curiosity. Arthur took him to the office and closed the door, making it clear that what he was about to discuss was delicate. "Lucas, I need your help," Arthur began, as he placed the photos and documents related to the father's position on the table. "I want you to find out everything you can about this man. We've already discovered something, but I feel like there's more we don't know." Lucas looked over the papers carefully, nodding slowly. "I can do that, but I'll need time, and maybe a little discretion." "You'll have everything you need," Arthur assured. "I just want the truth." Meanwhile, Julia stayed on the sidelines, although she couldn't ignore that something was happening. Every time she passed by the office, she heard fragments of conversations that seemed to revolve around her and Miguel. He knew Arthur was investigating, but he didn't know how much he had discovered. Days later, Lucas returned with information that confirmed Arthur's suspicions. The man who claimed to be Julia and Miguel's biological father had no connection to them. His background showed a pattern of manipulation and fraud, using vulnerable children for his own purposes. Additionally, several people in the neighborhood had seen how he forced them to beg for money on the streets. Arthur listened silently as Lucas explained everything he had found. When he finished, Arthur nodded, grateful but also filled with suppressed anger. "I couldn't believe someone had used those kids like that." That night, he decided to talk to Julia. He found her in the garden, sitting next to Miguel, who was drawing in a notebook with an enthusiasm that contrasted with the seriousness on his sister's face. Arthur walked over and gestured for Julia to come with him. She hesitated, but finally stood up, leaving Miguel to concentrate on his drawing. "We need to talk," Arthur said as they walked to a bench under a tree. Julia nodded, although her posture showed that she was defensive. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I found out something about that man who claims to be your father," Arthur began, observing Julia as she instantly tensed. "He is not who he says he is." Julia looked away, her jaw clenched. He remained silent, but Arthur could see the internal struggle she was facing. "Julia, I need you to be honest with me," he pressed on. "Did you know he wasn't your father?" She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment before responding. "I knew it," he finally admitted. "I never trusted him, but I had no other option. He always threatened to hurt us if we didn't help him. And Miguel, he doesn't understand everything, but I had to protect him." Arthur felt a mixture of compassion and frustration. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I could have done something." "Because I didn't know if I could trust you," Julia replied, her voice cracking slightly. "When you grew up on the streets like me, you learn not to trust anyone. But I tried to handle it alone, because I didn't want Miguel to suffer more." Arthur watched her in silence for a moment. There was something about Julia, a strength that did not correspond to her age. It was clear that he had been through more than any child should face, and yet he continued to fight for his brother. Julia said, and I promise that no one else is going to hurt them, not you or Miguel. Julia looked at him with eyes full of tears that she tried to hold back. I just want him to be safe. That's all that matters. And he will be, Arthur assured. But I also want you to know that you matter. Not only Miguel, you too. Julia didn't respond immediately, but something in her eyes changed. For the first time he seemed to let some of the burden he carried on his shoulders fall. The next day, Arthur took steps to ensure that the alleged father would not come near the children again. With the help of Alvaro and Lucas, he managed to have the man confronted by local authorities, ensuring that he could no longer manipulate others. Meanwhile, the relationship between Arthur and Julia began to change. Although there were still barriers to overcome, Arthur began to see her not only as a girl who needed protection, but as a person with a strength and resilience that inspired him. For her part, Julia began to trust him more, although she still had a lot to process. Miguel, oblivious to much of what was happening, continued drawing in his notebook and sharing his stories with Arthur, who every night felt more connected to those two children who had come into his life so unexpectedly. The mansion, which had previously been a place of silence and solitude, now seemed to be slowly filled with something Arthur had forgotten, hope. The days in the mansion had acquired a different rhythm. Julia and Miguel, although still adjusting to this new environment, were beginning to feel more secure. Julia, however, couldn't help but wonder how long this tranquility would last. Life had taught him that nothing was permanent, and he feared that the stability they were finding with Arthur was only temporary. But Arthur had other plans, and the decision he was about to make would change their lives forever. One afternoon, Arthur asked Julia and Miguel to accompany him to the office. The boy, always curious, ran in, excited to be in the adult's room, as he called it. Julia, on the other hand, entered at a slower pace, watching Arthur's expression for clues as to what he was going to tell them. Arthur was standing by his desk, a folder in his hands, but his face showed a mixture of seriousness and warmth. Thanks for coming, guys, he began, sitting down and pointing to the chairs in front of him. Julia and Miguel took their seats, and the latter could not contain his enthusiasm. What are we going to talk about? Miguel asked, shifting restlessly in his chair. Arthur smiled, placing the folder on the desk. About something important. I've been thinking a lot about you two and what you mean to me, and I think it's time to do something I should have done all along. Julia pursed her lips slightly, saying nothing, but her eyes were fixed on Arthur. Miguel, for his part, did not fully understand, but nodded as if he were in a serious conversation. I want them to stay here with me, not just as temporary guests. I want to make sure they have a safe place to live, where they can grow, study and have the opportunities they deserve. Julia felt short of breath for a moment. He didn't expect Arthur to be so direct. Miguel, on the other hand, let out a small cry of excitement. Can we really stay? Can. Arthur nodded, but raised a hand to calm the boy. There is something else. Julia, this is especially important to you. If we are going to do this, there is one condition. I need you to be honest with me, always. I don't want any more secrets or lies. Whatever you need to tell me, I want you to do it without fear. Julia looked down, processing his words. It had been difficult to trust anyone for so long, and even though Arthur had proven to be different, the idea of opening up completely still scared him. Arthur noticed his silence and continued. I know it's not easy, but I want you to understand something, Julia. I'm not doing this out of obligation, but because I believe in you. Because I see in you a strong and capable person, and I want to help you build a future for you and Miguel. Julia looked up, her eyes shining with a mix of emotions. What if I'm wrong? What if I say something you don't like? Arthur smiled softly. Then we will face it together, but I don't want to spend my remaining days without knowing the truth. You deserve to live without fear of being honest, and I deserve to know who you really are. Miguel, oblivious to the depth of the conversation, raised his hand as if he were in class. So we're going to live here forever? Arthur gave a light laugh and nodded. Yes, Miguel, whenever you want this will be your home. The boy jumped out of his chair and ran to Arthur to hug him. Julia watched them, and although she did not join the hug, a tear rolled down her cheek. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could trust someone. The following days were full of changes. Arthur began arranging for Julia and Miguel to enroll in a nearby school, something they had never had the opportunity to experience. Irene, although initially distrustful, began to accept the children as part of the household, even showing them little tricks in the kitchen and telling stories from her own childhood. Lucas, for his part, became a constant figure, visiting them and bringing simple gifts such as notebooks and pencils for Miguel. However, not everything was so simple. Julia was still struggling with the idea of opening up completely to Arthur. One afternoon, while they were walking in the garden, he decided to broach the subject. "Julia, I know you still have doubts," he said, watching as she walked a couple of steps in front of him. "It's difficult to change overnight," Julia responded, without looking directly at him. "I don't expect you to," Arthur said, "but I want you to know that I'm here, no matter what happens." Julia stopped and finally looked at him. "I've never had someone tell me that. I've always had to figure everything out alone." Arthur nodded, understanding more than she was saying. "That changes now. You are not alone. You haven't been since the day you entered my life." Julia nodded slowly, feeling that although there was still a long way to go, she was taking the first step toward something she had never known, trust. That night, while Miguel was fast asleep, Julia entered Arthur's office. He was going through some papers, but looked up when he saw her. "All good?" he asked, putting the documents aside. Julia nodded, and with a low but firm voice she said, "I want to try, to be honest, but I need you to be patient with me." Arthur stood up from his chair and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's all I asked for. Thank you for trusting me." At that moment, Julia felt something inside her change. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he had a chance to find out without fear. The routine in the mansion had begun to adapt to the presence of Julia and Miguel. The children filled the hallways with energy and laughter, something that previously seemed impossible in such a cold and methodical place. However, Donna Irene continued observing with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Although she could no longer ignore the positive change that the children had brought, it was also not easy for her to lower the barriers she had put up for years. One afternoon, while Julia and Miguel were playing in the garden under the supervision of Lucas, Irene decided to talk to Arthur. She found him in the living room reading a book in his favorite chair. He cleared his throat to get her attention, something unusual in his discreet demeanor. "Mr. Menezes, we can talk," he said with a softer tone than he usually used. Arthur looked up, somewhat surprised by the request. He closed the book and nodded, inviting her to sit down. "Of course, Irene. What happens?" She hesitated for a moment, her hands nervously playing with the apron she was wearing. Finally, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about the children, about Julia and Miguel, and about everything that has changed since they arrived here." Arthur nodded but didn't interrupt, letting Irene continue. "At first I must admit that I didn't agree with having them here," he confessed, lowering his gaze slightly, "not because I didn't think they needed help, but because they reminded me of things I had tried to forget." Arthur tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "What do you mean, Irene?" She looked directly at him, with a sincerity she rarely showed. "I had a daughter many years ago. She was just a little girl when I lost her. A disease that we could not treat in time. Since then, I focused on my work, on keeping this house in order, because it was the only way to not think about what I had lost." Arthur, shocked by the revelation, was silent for a moment before speaking. "Irene, I had no idea. Very sorry. I don't expect you to understand completely, sir," Irene continued, her voice breaking slightly, "but what I want to tell you is that I see something in those children now. A second chance, perhaps. And even though I can't get back what I lost, I want to help them. I want to do what I can so they have a better life. Arthur looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. Irene, you don't know how much this means to me. These children need someone like you, someone who can guide and care for them as only you know how. She nodded discreetly, wiping away a tear that had begun to roll down her cheek. Thank you, sir. I will do everything in my power. That same afternoon, Irene began to show a side that Julia and Miguel had not seen before. While the kids were in the kitchen, trying to bake cookies under her supervision, Irene rolled up her sleeves and showed them how to properly mix the dough. Miguel, with flour on his face, laughed while Julia tried not to laugh when she saw Irene smiling for the first time. "You're always so serious?" Miguel asked, with the innocence that characterized him. Irene paused for a moment, surprised by the question, and then answered. "Sometimes, Miguel, but I think you and Julia are changing that." Julia looked up from the tray of cookies, surprised by the comment, but said nothing. There was something about the way Irene spoke that made her feel safe, like she was finally seeing someone who understood more than what she was saying. The days that followed were marked by small gestures that, although subtle, transformed the dynamics in the mansion. Irene helped Julia organize her things for school, showing her how to plan her time and giving her advice that seemed to come from her own experience. With Miguel, he showed infinite patience, helping him write his first words correctly and encouraging him to draw more. One night, while Julia was in the living room studying, Irene came over with a cup of tea, placed it in front of her, and sat down next to her. Julia, somewhat uncomfortable, looked at her curiously. "I wanted to thank you, Julia," Irene said, breaking the silence. "Thank me? Because?" the girl asked, puzzled. "For reminding me what it means to care for someone," Irene responded with a small smile. "I spent many years walking away from that, but you and Miguel have shown me that I can still do it." Julia didn't know what to say at first, but finally nodded. "Thank you for everything you do for us. I know we are not easy." "That's what makes it worth it," Irene responded, giving his hand a gentle squeeze before standing up. Arthur, who had been watching from the door, felt something inside him light up as he watched the interaction between the two. For the first time, her home was not only full of life, but also a kind of connection she had forgotten existed. Over time, the mansion stopped being a place of silence and strict routines. The hallways echoed with laughter, meals were shared moments rather than simple formalities, and every member of the house, from Irene to the most distant employees, began to feel part of something bigger. Julia and Miguel had not only found a home, but they had also given Arthur and Irene a new reason to live fully. The mansion was more lively than usual that afternoon. The staff moved around, making sure everything was perfect. The dining room table had been elegantly set, with white tablecloths, fine china, and sparkling candelabras. Although the mansion had been the scene of many important events in the past, this occasion had a different, more intimate and warm air. Arthur had decided that it was time to bring together all the people who had been part of his life in recent months, those who, in different ways, had given him purpose when he thought he had nothing left. Donna Irene supervised the last details, making sure that each plate was in its place and that the employees carried out their tasks with precision. However, even she couldn't help but feel the mix of nostalgia and gratitude that permeated the air. Julia and Miguel, dressed in clothes that Irene had helped them choose, watched the activity from the hallway. For them, it was all new and exciting. Julia, always more reserved, stayed close to the wall, while Miguel, full of energy, tried to spy on what was cooking in the kitchen. "Do you think there will be dessert?" Miguel asked quietly, looking at his sister with eyes full of expectation. "Surely," Julia responded with a slight smile, without taking her eyes off the employees who were tidying up the dining room. Although she was nervous, she couldn't deny that the idea of being part of something so special excited her. When the time came, all the guests took their places at the table. Lucas, with his camera around his neck, sat close to the children, making sure to capture the most significant moments. Alvaro, although still somewhat skeptical, had accepted the invitation and was sitting on the other side, with an expression that oscillated between curiosity and discomfort. Irene, after making sure everything was in order, took her place, right next to Arthur. Arthur, dressed in a dark suit that gave him a solemn but warm air, stood up when everyone was seated. He raised his glass, asking for silence. The conversation stopped immediately, and everyone turned their attention to him. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice firm but charged with emotion. "A few months ago I would never have imagined being in this situation. I thought my life was coming to an end, leaving nothing that really mattered, but you have shown me that even in the darkest moments there is light." He paused, letting his words echo through the room. Julia, sitting next to Miguel, looked at him with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "Mrs. Irene, for years you have been my rock, keeping this home standing when I could barely do it, but in the last few months you have shown me a side of yourself that I did not know, and for that I am infinitely grateful." Irene looked down, moved, as she nodded softly. "Luke," Arthur continued, turning to the young photographer. "Your curious eyes have seen more than I could have imagined, and your willingness to help has shown me that the world is not as cold as we sometimes think. Thanks for being here." Lucas smiled shyly, raising his glass in thanks. "Alvaro," he said then, directing his attention to the lawyer, "I know that our differences have been many, but I also know that you have always had the best intentions. I hope that, after tonight, we can work together to ensure that my final wishes are fulfilled, not out of obligation, but because I trust you." Alvaro, although uncomfortable, nodded slowly, recognizing the sincerity in Arthur's words. Finally, Arthur turned to Julia and Miguel. He paused, as if to make sure the words he was about to say were correct. "Julia, Miguel, you have changed my life in ways I cannot describe. They have given me something I thought I would never have again. A family. I don't know how much longer I have left, but I want you to know that every day I spend with you will be a gift. My only wish is that they continue forward, strong and together, because they are capable of achieving incredible things." Miguel smiled widely, while Julia blinked rapidly to hold back tears. Everyone at the table seemed deeply moved by Arthur's words. Arthur raised his glass once more. "For the family I never knew I needed, and for the friends who showed me what really matters." Everyone toasted, and the dinner continued with an air of warmth and camaraderie. The employees, who normally stayed on the sidelines, peeked out from the kitchen, fascinated by the change in the atmosphere of the mansion. Miguel's laughter filled the room, as Lucas showed him how to use the camera. Julia was talking to Irene, who was giving her advice on how to handle the new challenges she would face at school. Even Alvaro, despite his reserved nature, shared anecdotes from his years working with Arthur. At the end of the night, when the plates were cleared and the wine had finished, Arthur called Alvaro aside. They sat in the office, where Arthur pulled out a copy of his revised will. "I want to make sure everything is in order," Arthur said, handing him the document. "I know you have your doubts, Alvaro, but this is what I want. Julia and Miguel deserve a chance, and I trust that you will make sure they have it." Alvaro took the document, looking at it carefully. After a moment he looked up. "I will do as you ask, Arthur. I promise." Arthur nodded, a sense of contentment washing over him, and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Thank you, Alvaro. That means more than you can imagine." As the farewells faded and the house settled back into its familiar stillness, Arthur found himself alone in the living room, gazing at the flames dancing in the fireplace. After years of searching, he finally experienced a tranquility that stemmed not from his riches or achievements, but from the relationships he had nurtured. He understood that time was slipping away, yet he was certain he had made the right choice. The days after the dinner were tranquil, yet imbued with a unique significance. Arthur appeared content, savoring the quiet joys shared with Julia and Miguel. In the tranquil mornings, she immersed herself in books amidst the garden's beauty, while Miguel played in close proximity and Julia focused on her studies. In the afternoons, he shared tales from his life, some humorous and others rich with lessons, capturing the children's rapt attention. The mansion, once a realm of silence and chill, now resonated with laughter, lively conversation, and a comforting warmth. Yet, it was clear to all that Arthur's time was running out. Though he never spoke of it, his vitality waned with each passing day, and Donna Irene quietly ensured that he remained as comfortable as she could manage. Julia, ever the keen observer, picked up on these subtle shifts, yet chose to remain silent. Miguel appeared unaware of the gravity of the situation, seemingly satisfied with the presence of a father figure he had never experienced before. One morning, Donna Irene discovered Arthur in her room, lounging in her cherished chair by the window. He appeared to be in slumber, yet as he approached, he realized that he was gone. A profound stillness enveloped the house, devoid of any drama. Irene paused, her eyes glistening with tears, before she gathered the strength to share the news with the others. Julia and Miguel, upon discovering the news, responded in completely contrasting manners. Miguel wept, seeking solace in Irene's embrace, while Julia, though tears streamed down her face, remained still, as if grappling with the profound loss of someone who had quickly become so significant in her life. Several days later, Alvaro convened everyone in Arthur's office to unveil the will. The atmosphere was heavy with significance, and while Julia and Miguel couldn't grasp the entirety of what lay ahead, they sensed that this was a pivotal moment. Alvaro took a moment to gather himself before he started. Arthur provided explicit guidance on the management of his legacy. Before delving into specifics, there's something he wishes to convey to you. He carefully opened a letter penned by Arthur, his own script evident, and started to read it aloud. Dear Julia and Miguel, if you are hearing this, it signifies that I am no longer by your side. The past few months have been the most impactful period of my life so far. They bestowed upon me something I never imagined I would possess, a family. I aim to ensure they possess the necessary tools to forge a brighter future, yet I also wish to request something further from them. Utilize what I provide not just for your own benefit, but also for other children who, like you, deserve a chance. Julia grasped Miguel's hand tightly, her heart heavy as she fought to keep her tears at bay. I wish to share something with you that I never found the courage to express during our time together. Years ago, following her mother's departure from the company, I made an effort to locate her. I realized I had erred, and I wished to express my regret, yet I never found the opportunity to do so. The thought that my self-centeredness played a role in his pain haunts me, and I wish for the day when they might find it in their hearts to forgive me for it. If anything positive came from that mistake, it led me to you. I truly appreciate the abundance you've provided, far beyond my wildest dreams. The atmosphere was hushed as Alvaro completed his reading. With tears brimming in her eyes, Julia finally found her voice. He didn't have to seek out my mother to express his apologies. All that he did for us was more than sufficient. Miguel, still holding on to Julia's hand, asked with a sense of wonder, "What shall we do now?" Alvaro pressed on with the reading of the will. Arthur bequeathed the majority of his estate to Julia and Miguel, stipulating that they utilize the funds to assist other children facing comparable circumstances. He also bequeathed to them the mansion, accompanied by a particular stipulation. A sanctuary was to be created for children in need. The revelation rendered the entire room momentarily speechless. Then Julia voiced her thoughts. Let's get started. This house will become a haven for children, offering them the opportunities we once missed. Lucas, having quietly captured the scene with his camera, stepped in. I'll be there for whatever they require. This endeavor holds significant value. Donna Irene, who had been quiet until that moment, walked over to Julia and Miguel. I am here to assist you. Arthur inspired me to keep going, and now you all are my family. With Alvaro, Lucas, and Irene by their side, Julia and Miguel embarked on the journey of transforming the mansion. The initial months presented significant challenges. Renovations were necessary, permits had to be secured, and, above all, it was crucial to locate the children in need of the shelter. Gradually, the project began to take form. The mansion, once an emblem of solitude, transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Young ones of various ages populated the corridors, each carrying a unique narrative, yet all embarking on a fresh chapter. Julia, despite her youth, embraced a leadership position, making certain that every child felt welcomed and nurtured. Miguel, in his role, became the essence of the shelter, radiating joy and enthusiasm to all around him. In a room of the shelter, Julia placed a photo of Arthur beside a plaque that read, "In memory of the one who showed us that family is not always defined by blood, but by heart." With the passage of time, the mansion emerged as a symbol of hope for the community. Julia and Miguel not only celebrated Arthur's legacy, but they also broadened its reach, impacting lives he could never have envisioned. Her narrative, though defined by sorrow, transformed into a testament to the strength of love, the grace of forgiveness, and the possibility of renewal.